Hello everyone. My group and I chose to talk about when to perform pharmacoepidemiology studies. First, let's take a look at our outline. We'll be discussing the reasons to perform a PE study, the difference between safety and risk, and the determinants of risk tolerance. Let's tackle the reasons first. As with everything in life, we need to weigh the costs and risks versus the benefit. Obviously, the cost of a PE study is the cost to conduct it itself, the time put into it, the money spent on it, and the labor it takes. Other costs is opportunity cost of other research. Other research could be left undone if this PE study is done. So, is it more important than the other one or not? We need to weigh that versus the benefit of this study. Whereas the risks could be errors in study conclusions, such as identifying adverse events when in fact there isn't one, or a false reassurance about drug safety when that drug is in fact not safe. We can fix these with the appropriate study design, being an expert researcher, and a thorough interpretation. On the other hand, the benefit is divided into four different categories: regulatory, marketing, legal, and clinical. Perhaps the most obvious and compelling reason to perform a post-marketing PE study is regulatory. Usually done with a randomized clinical trial, they're to assess either drug efficacy or toxicity or both, such as the phase IV study on cimetidine and prazosin. Another compelling reason is early drug approval. If the company feels that serious problems can be detected rapidly and reliably, they can feel more comfortable about releasing the drug earlier, and they can be motivated by large economic impact of earlier release. For example, zidovudine was released earlier in phase 2 after limited testing and future data from efficacy and safety studies showed that the dose recommended should be decreased. On the other hand, some post-marketing studies of drugs arise in response to case reports of adverse reactions reported to the regulatory agency. One response to such a report might be to suggest a labeling change. Often a more appropriate response, clinically and commercially, would be to propose a PE study. This study would explore whether this adverse event in fact occurs more often in those patients exposed to the drug in comparison to the ones not. Finally, drugs are obviously marketed at different times in different countries. A post-marketing PE study conducted in a country which marketed a drug relatively early could be useful in demonstrating the safety of the drug to regulatory agencies in countries which have not yet permitted the marketing of the drug. This is becoming increasingly feasible as both the industry and field of PE are becoming more international and regulators are collaborating more. Our next category is marketing. It is clear that a major underlying reason for some PE studies is the potential marketing impact of those answers. In fact, some companies make the marketing branch of the company responsible for PE instead of the medical branch. And thus, because of the known limitations in the information available about the effects of a drug at the time of its initial marketing, many physicians are appropriately hesitant to prescribe a drug until a substantial amount of experience in its use has been gathered. A formal post-marketing surveillance study can speed that process, as well as clarifying any advantages or disadvantages a drug has to its competitors. Another marketing benefit is product name recognition. Presumably helps sales, but its disadvantage is that it's extremely expensive and less likely to be providing as scientifically useful information than most other alternatives available. Another benefit is drug repositioning. It develops new markets for the drugs and it helps usually approved drugs with restrictive labelings. Example, Britilium was initially approved for marketing in the US only for the treatment of life-threatening arrhythmias. Approval for more uses requires additional data. These data can often be obtained from pharmacoepidemiology studies. It can also be used to protect the major investment made in developing and testing a new drug. Moving to a legal stand, PE argues against the saying, "What you don't know won't hurt you," because knowledge is power. Once said company knows all of its drug side effects, it can protect itself against any lawsuits that can ensue. Thus, post-marketing surveillance studies can theoretically be useful as legal prophylaxis. Moving to the clinical side, the major reason for most PE studies is hypothesis testing. The hypothesis to be tested can be based on the structure or the chemical class of the drug, such as the example mentioned below. Of course, the hypothesis to be tested can involve beneficial drugs effects as well as harmful drug effects, subject to some important methodologic limitations. Also, hypothesis generation is to screen for previously unknown and unsuspected drug effects, can be determined by the safety profile of the drug, can be previously experienced with other drugs in the same class. Disease to be treated is as an important determinant for additional post-studies. Drugs for chronic illness, for example for long-term use, drugs for common disease, that means that many patients are exposed, and drugs for mild or self-limiting disease, they have serious toxicity and less acceptability. The second part of the presentation will tackle the safety versus risk. Now, clinical experts are used to thinking about drug safety as a standard that must be met before a drug is approved for marketing in the US, is that it needs to be proven safe and effective under conditions of intended use. It is important, however, to differentiate safety from risk. Virtually nothing is without some risk. Even staying in bed is associated with the risk of acquiring bed sores. Certainly, no drug is completely safe. Yet the unfortunate misconception by the public persists that drugs are and should be without any risk at all. Use of a safe drug, however, still carries some risk. It would be better to think in terms of degrees of safety. Specifically, a drug is safe if its risks are judged to be acceptable. Measuring risk is an objective but relies on probability. A judgment about safety is a personal and or social value judgment about the acceptability of that risk. Thus, assessing safety requires two extremely different kinds of activities: measuring risk and judging the acceptability of those. Moving to risk tolerance. The decision to conduct post-marketing surveillance PE study also depends on the willingness to operate risks. From a manufacturer's perspective, the risk of a potential regulatory or legal problem that may arise, and a patient's perspective, the willingness to tolerate adverse reactions. So what are the factors that affect the acceptability of these risks? First, we have the features of the adverse outcome, such as severity, reversibility, frequency, dread disease, immediate versus delayed, all people versus sensitive people, known with certainty or not. Acceptability of risks depends mostly on severe adverse reactions, especially for the ones that result in permanent harm like birth defects, example like tampon use and toxic shock syndrome, individual tolerance of its risk, especially for the drugs generating fear or emotion, example AIDS and cancer. It also depends on the adverse outcome if it's immediate or delayed, such as anti-smoking efforts, and the type A versus type B adverse outcomes. Adverse A is an exaggerated but usual pharmacological effect of a drug, and type B is more difficult to predict or even detect, usually less tolerable. Example, in order to prevent aminophylline-induced arrhythmias and seizures, one can begin therapy at lower doses and follow serum levels carefully. It also depends on how well is the adverse event established. The same adverse effect is obviously less tolerable if one knows with certainty that it is caused by a drug than if it is only a remote possibility. Moving on to the factors affecting the acceptability of risks, we have the characteristics of the exposure, such as essential versus optional, present versus absent, alternatives available, risk assumed voluntary, and drug use as intended versus likely misuse. And finally, the perceptions of the evaluator. The acceptability of a risk is very different, depending upon whether an exposure is essential or optional. Major adverse effects are much more acceptable when one is using a therapy that can save or prolong life, such as chemotherapy for malignancies. Pharmaceutical products intended for use in healthy individuals, such as vaccines and contraceptives, must be exceedingly low in risk to be considered acceptable. The acceptability of a risk is also dependent on whether the risk is from the presence of a treatment or its absence. Example, the 6 years delay in introducing beta blockers into the US market highly increased the mortality rate in heart failure patients and CAD. If a drug is the only available treatment for a disease, particularly a serious disease, then a greater risks will be considered acceptable. Example, zidovudine was allowed to be marketed for treatment of AIDS despite its toxicity and the limited testing which had been performed. They weighed the risk versus the benefit here again. Whether a risk is assumed voluntary is also important to its acceptability. Patients should be aware of possibly toxic effects of drugs that they are prescribed. When a risk is higher than it is with the usual therapeutic use of a drug, ask the patient for formal informed consent to protect yourself legally. From a societal perspective, concern about whether a drug will be used as intended or whether misuse is likely, misuse in and of itself can represent a risk of the drug. The perception of the evaluator, finally, depends ultimately upon the perception of the individuals who are making the decision about whether a risk is acceptable or not. Example, if two patients, A and B, are being educated by their physician about the same drug, patient A could feel safe taking the drug while patient B might not. Thank you for listening, and a special thanks for Tamara Hbai'a, Maria Serena Shiha, and Karina Rai.